Hi, thank you very much for joining us for this discussion about, well, predictions in general. We're going to talk about some of the predictions that we made for last year, and we're going to go into the predictions that we have for 2026. And joining me is Daniel dos Santos. He's the VP for Vedere Labs, our research arm here at Forescout. Thank you, Daniel.
Well, thank you so much, Rick. Always a pleasure and very nice to talk to you about not just predictions, but cybersecurity in general.
It's weird, isn't it? Like we work together basically every day, and then we have to pretend that we're meeting for the first time in a while when we do a discussion.
Well, you are the host, right? So I have to thank you for the opportunity.
So let's talk about predictions in general. Like I think everybody's used to the fact that cybersecurity vendors come up with predictions. We all kind of come up with them around the same time of year. In some cases, I think people are a little jaded, if that's the right word, about cybersecurity predictions, because it's like, it's like the sweater that you got from your Aunt Mary at Christmas. It's the one thing you didn't want to get, but we all do it. Why do we do it? What's the point of predictions?
No, that's a great question. There are longer term predictions that we do, which are more developing proofs of concepts and understanding what might come in 2, 3, 4, 5 years ahead, right? And why we should prepare now. And then there are things that are a little bit more, we notice what's going on and we think that, okay, this is starting this year to become relevant. Next year, it will be definitely relevant again. So if we take some examples from last year, for instance, right, we started talking about nation states and hacktivist groups kind of merging together and blurring the lines and all that. And that's something that other researchers or other companies talked as well. But if I go back to the prediction that we had, nation states will hijack grassroots hacktivist cyber attacks. And that's something that we actually saw happening very, very, obviously this year, right? We saw, especially there was a report we did on the 2025 H1 threat review, where we were talking about a specific group called APT Iran, where it became obvious that at a certain point, they were not a state-sponsored group. They were really a grassroots group. And from a certain moment onwards, they started talking about ICS attacks, and they started talking about new methods and forwarding messages from other groups, cyber avengers specifically. It became really clear that they were changing the tone and they were becoming more and more aligned with, state action, state propaganda, and so on. So that's a trend that we see definitely growing and likely going into next year as well. I think you also had some predictions last year that were, relevant and that became true for sure this year, right?
There was, I mean, it was a year ago, right? There was definitely, of course, I had to speak about AI because that's the law. You have to talk about AI in cybersecurity. Yeah. But I think there was a prediction there about autonomy in attacks, AI beginning to shoulder more of the load when it comes to using advanced capabilities. I know that we did some research at Forescout about whether AI was capable of writing malicious code, and kind of the conclusion was sort of, but not quite. But I think the prediction of AI taking on more of the load this year, I think I can score myself a solid B+, I guess. I don't know if I'll be brave enough to give myself an A, but certainly in recent news, seeing the report from Anthropic about, according to them, Chinese state actors taking advantage of their service to use agentic capabilities to automate basically huge swathes of the attack process. Their estimate that it was 80 to 90% of the load of the attack was automated. Of course, there's still a human in the loop at this point in time. But from a prediction perspective, I would say we got that one. So
I would give you. Go ahead.
Go on. You give me what?
No, I would give you an A definitely for that prediction, because I think that it's also matching very well with what we saw on the research, right? That we said that it wasn't yet capable of doing exploits and finding vulnerabilities, doing exploits and so on. But as models advanced and as agentic AI became more of a thing, that would definitely improve. And that's what we are seeing, right, with agentic AI.
Yeah, because the research that we did on the LLM stuff was kind of pre-agentic being widely available as a capability, right? Yeah. And as is the case with many things AI, when certain innovations are available to the wider public, they become game changers. And pace of development is kind of nonstop. So, there's some more of that in the 2026 predictions, which I think we should dive into. But I guess the thing is, what's the point of doing it? Is it does give you time to prepare. I mean, think back to the ransomware for IoT proof of concept that came out of Vedere Labs in 2022, I think.
Yeah.
Where we were saying, the threat act, we developed a whole proof of concept that said the threat actor comes in through an exposed IP camera, they laterally move in the Windows estate, they drop ransomware, they laterally move into the OT estate, and they use all of that as leverage to get the victim to pay the ransom. Had you been listening at the time, you may have said, oh, here's some changes we can make around network segmentation or whatever it may be. And you would have, forewarned is forearmed. And when the Akira ransomware group actually began doing that, you would have been in a better position. So kind of that's the point, I guess, in a nutshell. All right, what about 2026? What do we got?
Yeah, so for 2026, one of the first things that I've started looking into that's very, very new, let's say, it's definitely something we haven't discussed in the past, is that we believe that the transition, the migration to post-quantum cryptography will become something that is a forefront concern for organizations, right? We started noticing this year, last year was the year of the standardization, let's say, of post-quantum cryptography. This year was the year of adoption of that technology into very basic software libraries, right? OpenSSH, OpenSSL, and everything that's used to build other things, let's say. And I believe that next year it will be both the time when more devices, more assets will start leveraging these libraries, these applications, but also organizations will start definitely building their inventories and understanding what is already migrated to PQC, what isn't migrated, and what's the threat landscape, what's the actual risk, and so on. So basically, it will be the year of understanding what is the actual challenge to do this PQC migration, right? The reality is that with current timelines, we have something like 5 years before, or 4 years if we're talking 2026 already, right? 2030 is more or less the agreed timeline worldwide almost for the deprecation of classical or traditional cryptography, let's put it this way. And I think that organizations will start noticing, for instance, that if they're procuring new devices, new network equipment, whatever is connected to the network next year, and that has a depreciation of 5 years, that's going to hit the timeline after the deprecation of traditional cryptography, and so on and so forth, right? Like all the devices that you have there that are supposed to run for even longer than that, medical devices, operational technology, lots of other unmanaged assets that are somewhere hidden, behind a server rack or something like that you don't often think about, but they implement some crypto, they communicate with encrypted streams, and they will need to be migrated as well, right?
What's the implication? Like, so we spoke about forewarned is forearmed. Let's say some organizations don't get ahead of this. What's the outcome? Why should they?
I think the problem will be with, in this specific case, with regulations, and at some point this will be mandated, right? Especially for a critical infrastructure, it will be like it's not acceptable anymore that you use traditional cryptography for sensitive information. If you think of healthcare and so on, so rather than waiting for the regulation, waiting for the mandate, and then catching up later and kind of scrambling resources and all that, why not start preparing now as part of a natural, evolution, a natural cycle, and so on. The other thing is we've started noticing, we as a cybersecurity community, not just Vedere Labs, not just my team and so on, not just Forescout, but last year and this year, increased attacks where nation states, in this case, are gaining initial access via routers, via network equipment, establishing sort of a prepositioning capability there, and potentially in the future using that for siphoning off large volumes of data, right? That could be, preparation to mount an attack where if you have a quantum computer that can break traditional crypto, you siphon off all this data now. It's called, everybody knows harvest now, decrypt later, right? And if you're not preparing for that now, your data, which is private, sensitive, and confidential, and so on, might already be kind of exfiltrated to someone's server and might be decrypted in the near future.
That's related to another one. It's on the Forescout blog, forescout.com/blog, where we've published all of these predictions for next year. There's prediction number 5 is kind of a related point, where we're saying that attackers will accelerate the exploitation of edge devices and IoT. Now, as you said, kind of that trend was already in place, right? We're seeing more vulnerabilities, faster weaponization, more groups. Basically, everything about it is accelerating. So they will accelerate even more. That sounds worrying.
It is worrying, and part of it, I believe, has to do with what we were discussing before. For instance, the AI, the use of AI tools, and basically, it's the reality is, unfortunately, it is becoming easier. It is becoming faster to find vulnerabilities, to exploit them, to write proof of concept, to write custom malware. We don't see any of those things I just mentioned decreasing, right? Like this year, it hasn't decreased from last year, and it won't decrease next year again. The trend with the edge devices has been more 0 days, right? And that is on routers, on firewalls, on VPN concentrators. And that's very scary, because 0 days, there was a time when 0 days were sort of rare, or, big news. I think there were weeks this year where we've had more than 1 0 day the same week on different edge devices, or sometimes even the same edge device from the same vendor. So it's becoming more and more concerning, and the acceleration there is in this regard, right? That with new capabilities available to attackers, it will become even more difficult for defenders to make sure that they are safeguarding their networks against those exploits.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there was another one that you came up with around hacktivism that was kind of a continuation, right? So that was using confusion as a weapon. So not just like a legit attack where something's actually happened, but weaponizing confusion around, or uncertainty around an attack.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of a natural evolution, because we see many claims in hacktivist groups that are not entirely true, exaggerated, not necessarily well researched, let's say, or not well understood even by the hacktivists themselves. So obviously we talked about the attack on our honeypot this year, which a group claimed as a real attack because they didn't understand it was a honeypot. But we see from that same group and from other groups videos where they are just clicking around on HMIs, and there are clearly responses from the POC saying, like no response, or nothing happens, or there's no actual change of the physical process behind that HMI, but they still post it as if they are setting fire to something, or destroying something, or something like that. In many cases, this might seem like carelessness, or like they don't really have the time or the capability or the sophistication to understand what's going on. But it could very well be just a sort of a false flag operation, right, where you just basically post something there with the intent to scare, whether or not it's real, or in some cases knowing that it's not entirely real, knowing that's not entirely true, but the psychological effect, the kind of the psyops part of it, is more relevant even than the cyber or the kinetic.
Implications for operators as well, right? I mean, they still have to do the investigation. They still have to effectively prove a negative, which is not the most pleasant exercise to have to go through, but particularly in critical national infrastructure or production lines or whatever it might be. And you may even be, preemptive voluntary shutdowns of systems or production lines or whatever it might be, in order to satisfy yourself that the claim is untrue, right? So even an attack that never happened can actually have quite serious implications for the supposed victim.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of implications for victims and so on, you had a very interesting prediction about ransomware and supply chains, right? Can you go over that one a little bit more? I think that's something also that we started seeing this year, and I really, really enjoyed reading that one, because it kind of brings to the point something that it is probably the natural evolution of ransomware, right?
Yeah, so I was thinking, actually, what prompted that one is I was thinking about the attack on Jaguar Land Rover, JLR, this year. And, I remember reading all the news stories about it. And actually, the implications further up their supply chain, in that the people that were obviously selling into JLR, the people for whom JLR was a customer, in many cases were going out of business, because that's their primary customer. Everything they engineer is around supplying that customer, and JLR stops production. They stop buying from their supply chain, and it had really serious implications for them. But then I thought, if you look at that from an attacker's perspective, what do you learn, or what are the possibilities or implications? And I thought, how about that gives attackers the idea to kind of flip the script a little bit on the methodology of ransomware. So right now, as you find a victim, you attack that victim in one way or another, whether that's by encrypting the data or stealing the data and threatening a leak or whatever it might be, going through the data and contacting the people who are in the data. There are many different things that criminals do, but they still demand the ransom from the person they've attacked, right? That's kind of the constant in ransomware. So looking at the JLR thing, I thought, well, actually, it proves the mutual reliance between supply chain and further down the supply chain. So why would attackers not then go upstream? So I came up with this thing, for want of a better term, I've called it reverse ransom. And I'm saying that it seems like, as you say, a natural evolution, that from an attacker perspective, you could attack further smaller companies further up that supply chain, where nominally they have lower budget, so therefore less security, softer targets. Maybe you can take out the top 3 or 4 suppliers to a large organization, but then you don't extort the ransom from the people you've attacked. You travel back downstream to the bigger organization, say the JLR in this equation, and you send them an email. And in the example email I put together, it says, "This is a commercial extortion event. We are, the risk lies with you. We haven't encrypted your stuff. We've done that further upstream, but the business continuity risk is with you. And therefore we are asking you to pay what I called a service restoration fee." So it's just another form of extortion, but it's saying, if you want to get your raw materials in, or your parts for whatever you're manufacturing, then you have to pay the ransom to unlock your supply chain, which we have currently locked up. It means that you can still ask for the big payment because you're extorting the larger entity, but actually your route in is going to be significantly easier because you're going after much smaller entities. And there was a concept I was writing about just the other day about risk, and all this was kind of connected in my mind, is that actually you don't control your risk anymore. You just share it. There are aspects you can control, but there's so much else in this fully interconnected ecosystem of commerce that is out of your control, that it's way past time that you have processes in place to allow you to assure yourself of acceptable risk further up the supply chain, because I fully expect ransomware actors, at the very least, to be taking advantage of that. And that's kind of where that came from.
And it's quite interesting, because going back kind of full circle to the beginning of this conversation, where we were talking about last year's prediction. Last year, there was a prediction about ransomware not evolving so much technically anymore from the point of view of exploits and so on, but evolving from the financial damage, from the extortion kind of impact. And that became reality this year, right? We didn't have a super technical leap in ransomware capabilities. They are very sophisticated and advanced already, but they are looking for other ways to inflict damage, to demand a ransom, to extort companies, and so on. And now this prediction for next year is narrowing down into the supply chain issue. So I think that's interesting to see this kind of progression of the predictions as well, right? And which match the landscape.
Well, there's another one that was related as well. The other thing, or one of the other things that I proposed was around social engineering, which also, in my mind, was highly related to the current ransomware landscape. And I was thinking about groups like Shiny Hunters, Scattered Spider, who rely on social engineering quite a lot for initial compromise, right? Getting people to expose passwords, doing SIM swaps, those kinds of things. And I was thinking, if I were in their position, with the heat that you're feeling from law enforcement and the interest in those threat actors on a global scale, because they have been, phenomenally successful, and I don't want to make it sound positive. I mean phenomenally in terms of large scale. They have had some very big compromises, including very recently the Gainsight one, right? So this is ongoing. What would I want to do if I were in their shoes? Well, I would want to remove myself from that heat as much as possible. And I thought, well, that would lend itself to the birth of something which I called social engineering as a service. So some of the things that those groups are really good at is that social engineering aspect. A lot of the rest of it is kind of run of the mill. So if as a criminal group they wanted to continue to make the money, why would they not start just offering the bit they're really good at, the social engineering part, taking advantage also of things like you can bundle together things like AI voice cloning, scripted call flows, because they know the best way to do the social engineering, fake, authorization links or multi-factor authentication pop-ups. And they could then distance themselves from the actual compromise. So the compromise, just like we see in the ransomware ecosystem, it used to be the same group making the ransomware and doing the compromise. That almost never happens anymore. It's one group providing the tools and affiliates actually doing the compromises. If you're a group that relies on social engineering, you can look for that arm's length approach, that distancing approach, and say, okay, I'm just going to sell what I'm good at, and other people are going to take the heat for actually doing the compromise. So I think that's another strong contender for something that we'll see in the criminal ecosystem in 2026, is the rise of this social engineering as a service, which is kind of related to that.
Yeah, which is also sort of an evolution of phishing kits and things like that have been happening for a while, and definitely it's a bigger evolution of that. And it goes back to also another prediction, which was about the further specialization of groups, right? As you said, we see more and more specialization happening in terms of initial access brokers, people dealing with ransomware operations, ransomware development, negotiations, and so on and so on. I think this further specialization will definitely continue to happen, and it makes total sense for all the reasons that you just presented.
Yeah, we said specialization, but also using similar or the same tools, right? So what that means from a defender perspective is that it's actually the shared behaviors behind an attack will be a much better indicator of who you're dealing with than simply the brand name of who's claiming the attack, which actually makes quite a bit of difference when you're trying to come up with your defensive strategy or your investment plan or whatever it might be for cybersecurity going forwards, right? I think there's one we haven't mentioned, which is, I mentioned Gainsight just now, and that's kind of like it's coming through quicker than I would like, but it's about the slow but steady move away from phishing. I know phishing is still absolutely dominant. It's still huge percentage of attacks start with phishing because many services still rely on passwords. But we are, as information technology in general, not just cybersecurity, slowly moving away from password-based systems, even slowly moving away, arguably, from things like multi-factor authentication, because we're designing new passwordless systems, which will have a slow ramp-up period, but it's happening, right? MFA arguably is a mitigation on a weak system, passwords, right? It's just something to extend the lifetime of password-based systems. So we're moving into more passwordless implementation. So the prediction was that threat actors or that exploitation of software as a service app permissions and tokens and things, platforms like Microsoft 365, Salesforce, Slack, all those other things will become much more attractive because by abusing those consents and tokens that the authentication relies on in those services, attackers are able to quietly move between tenants and hop across services and even maintain access after password resets. So while I don't expect it to surpass phishing next year, I think we will continue to see the rise of that as a slowly becoming a preferred method of access.
Yeah, and that connects to something which is not a prediction, wasn't a prediction last year. It's not something that we're predicting for next year, but it's something that we have definitely noticed happening, which is the rise of info stealers, right? And info stealers are used these days not only to steal credentials, passwords, and so on, but also tokens, also, even
Right.
crypto wallets and things like that. So definitely at the end of the day, whatever you're using to authenticate passcodes or whatever that might be, threat actors will try to find a way to, with some sort of technological innovation, get access to that. And if it's a token, then, it even enables other types of accesses. So I think you're spot on that prediction. As we move away from passwords, threat actors will also move away from just getting, access to credentials, and they'll get access to tokens or things that are more, immediately usable in an attack.
Absolutely. So there you have it. Daniel and I were chatting before we recorded this, and we're like, yeah, we're not going to go longer than 15 minutes, 20 max. We're already on 26 minutes. So I think we should draw a line under. We have managed to actually hit every prediction, which I don't think we expected to do. But there it is. There's your forewarned is forearmed. There's your from Forescout, your opportunity to look ahead and begin to make plans related to these predictions. Of course, other things are going to happen too, and we'll continue to talk about those throughout the year. So keep an eye on forescout.com/blog for all of the research that comes out of Vedere Labs and responses to ongoing compromises or activities or developments in cybersecurity. And Daniel, thanks so much for giving me a bit more of your time today. I've enjoyed the conversation, and hopefully we'll have many more. Thank you very much for watching.